What if the most devastating blow in this entire war wasn't fired from a tank, a missile launcher, or a fighter jet, but planned in silence, executed in darkness, and felt across an entire military supply chain in a matter of hours? That question is what makes what happened recently so extraordinary. Because what Ukraine just pulled off didn't just damage a target, it threatened to unravel the entire logistical spine of Russia's southern military operation. And it happened so fast that Moscow barely had time to react. Before we go any further, if you've never hit that subscribe button, now is the time. This channel breaks down the real mechanics of modern warfare, the strategy behind the headlines, and the moments history will remember. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who's been following this war closely. They need to see this. Now, let's talk about what actually happened, and why it matters so much more than most people realize. To understand the full weight of these strikes, you need to understand what Crimea means to Russia's war machine. This is not just a peninsula that Russia illegally annexed in 2014. In the context of this war, Crimea is a fortress, a supply depot, a command hub, and a symbol, all rolled into one. Every major Russian operation in the south depends on Crimea. Troops, fuel, artillery shells, vehicle parts, medical supplies, reinforcements, all of it flows through Crimea at some point. Sever that connection, and you don't just inconvenience the Russian military, you begin to strangle it. That's why what Ukraine did over the span of roughly 48 hours was nothing short of a calculated masterstroke. Between the 9th and 11th of June, Ukrainian forces struck a total of 6 bridges. 6. Not one bridge, not 2. 6 bridges, in rapid succession, each one connected to the network that keeps Russian forces in the south alive and operational. The Henichesk Bridge, the Chongar Bridge, and then 4 more crossings along the Armyansk-Perekop corridor, the last remaining land gateway into Crimea from the north. Let that sink in. Ukraine systematically dismantled every major land route connecting Crimea to the Russian military apparatus in southern Ukraine, and they did it in less than 2 days. Now, how do you pull off something like that? How does a military that has been under immense pressure for years suddenly execute an operation of this scope and precision? The answer is patience and intelligence, and something that most people underestimate in modern warfare: sequencing. Ukraine didn't just launch a wave of strikes and hope for the best. They planned this like a chess player thinking 6 moves ahead. They started with the Chongar Bridge. They hit it once, several days earlier, to test defenses and cause disruption. Then, on the morning of June 9th, they hit it again, this time harder, this time with the clear intent of making it unusable. Here's where the strategy gets brilliant. When Chongar went down, Russian logistics commanders had to reroute. That's basic military planning. You always have an alternate route. Russia's alternate was the Henichesk Bridge and the Arabat Spit, a long, narrow strip of land running along the coast that connects to Crimea from the east. It's not ideal, but it works. Russia began redirecting convoys there almost immediately, and Ukraine was watching every single moment of it. The morning of June 10th, Ukrainian forces struck the Henichesk Bridge. The alternate route was now compromised. Russian logistics were suddenly scrambling. 2 of their primary crossings were damaged or destroyed. Convoys were backed up or being rerouted again, and every kilometer of extra road added exposure and risk. But Ukraine wasn't done. On June 11th, they hit the Armyansk-Perekop corridor. 4 more bridges. This was the last remaining major land connection between Crimea and Russian forces further north, and Ukraine went after all of it at once. By the time the dust settled, the total number of targeted bridges had reached 6. Every significant land route into Crimea from Russian-held southern Ukraine had been struck. Russian military planners, who had spent years building out their logistics in this region, suddenly found themselves staring at a map where every primary road looked the same: blocked, damaged, or dangerously exposed. This is what military analysts mean when they talk about logistical isolation. It's not about destroying soldiers. It's about cutting off the flow that keeps those soldiers fighting. Ammunition runs low. Fuel doesn't arrive. Spare parts for vehicles and artillery stop coming, and gradually, sometimes faster than people expect, combat effectiveness collapses. Now, estimates suggest that roughly 50,000 Russian troops were operating in southern Ukraine at the time of these strikes. Another 60,000 or so were stationed inside Crimea. That's potentially more than 100,000 soldiers whose supply lines were suddenly operating under severe strain, all of them, in one form or another, dependent on routes that Ukraine had just systematically targeted. You're watching this. You care about what's really happening in this war. So do the thousands of people who haven't found this channel yet. Copy the link to this video right now and send it to 3 people, a friend, a family member, a group chat. Let's get this information out there, because the mainstream news isn't explaining it like this. Now let's talk about the Henikesk Bridge specifically, because this is where the story becomes even more remarkable. The Henikesk Bridge wasn't just a piece of infrastructure. It was a strategic lifeline that Russian military planners had specifically built into their contingency plans. Think about that. When Russian commanders sat down and mapped out what they would do if their primary routes were ever threatened, Henikesk was part of the answer. It was the backup. It was the route convoys would take when the main roads became too dangerous. Ukrainian intelligence knew this. For weeks before the strike, Ukrainian reconnaissance assets, both human intelligence on the ground and unmanned systems in the air, were studying the area with extraordinary focus. They weren't just looking at the bridge, they were mapping the entire defensive ecosystem around it. Patrol schedules, guard rotations, the positioning of radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, air defense deployments. They built a detailed picture of exactly how the Russians were protecting this crossing. What they reportedly found was a vulnerability. The Pantsir S-1 air defense systems assigned to protect the bridge had gaps. Coverage wasn't perfect. There were corridors, narrow windows, through which Ukrainian drones could potentially operate without being intercepted. And when the attack came, Ukraine exploited exactly those windows. Waves of kamikaze drones and precision-guided systems came in targeting the most structurally critical points of the bridge. Not random strikes, precise ones. The kind of strikes designed to cause maximum structural damage with minimum exposure time for the attacking systems. The result was severe damage to the crossing, rendering it essentially unusable for heavy military traffic. And the ripple effects were immediate. Convoys carrying artillery ammunition, fuel, rocket system reloads, and spare parts found their preferred routes suddenly cut off. Russian units in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, already engaged in heavy combat, suddenly had to think very carefully about how they were going to sustain operations. Fuel tankers that normally moved along short, relatively secure routes were now being forced onto longer roads. Longer roads mean more exposure. More exposure means more risk. More risk means either more losses or more caution, and both of those slow down military operations significantly. The Chongar Bridge, meanwhile, had already been one of the most critical logistics links in the entire southern theater. Before these strikes, a massive portion of the traffic moving between Crimea and Russian-held Kherson passed over Chongar. This wasn't a secondary route. This was a main artery. Losing it, or even degrading it significantly, created immediate and severe pressure on Russian supply chains. Ukrainian drone operators flew their systems at low altitude to stay below radar coverage, threading through defensive gaps in a way that required exceptional coordination and real-time information. Satellite imagery captured afterward showed significant structural damage. Sections of the bridge were effectively out of commission. Russian engineers moved quickly to set up emergency pontoon crossings nearby, temporary floating bridges that can handle some traffic but are far more vulnerable, far more limited in capacity, and far more difficult to maintain under operational conditions. Heavy armor needs solid, high-capacity crossings. A pontoon bridge works in an emergency. It doesn't work as a permanent solution for sustaining an active military campaign. Russia knew this. Ukraine knew Russia knew this. And that's exactly why these temporary fixes didn't solve the problem. They just bought a little time while making Russian logistics even more visible and vulnerable to follow-up strikes. The broader effect began to stretch across the entire southern front. Units near Mariupol, units operating in sectors closer to Mariupol, units positioned along the coastline, all of them began feeling the downstream effects of what was happening to their supply chain. Commanders at various levels reportedly started rationing ammunition more carefully. Flexibility, the ability to rapidly shift forces or launch localized attacks, began to diminish. And when military flexibility diminishes, defensive lines tend to stiffen in ways that create their own vulnerabilities. Now here's something that deserves real attention: the Armyansk-Perekop corridor. The Perekop Isthmus is one of the most historically significant pieces of land in the entire region. For centuries, this narrow strip of land, sometimes only 5 to 7 kilometers wide, has been the gateway into Crimea from the north. Every army that has ever tried to take Crimea has had to think about Perekop. It's a natural choke point, a place where geography itself forces movement into a narrow, predictable, easily defended path. Since 2022, Russia has turned this corridor into a fortified zone. Trenches, anti-tank obstacles, layered defensive positions. The Perekop corridor wasn't just a road, It was a hardened military installation designed to be the last line of logistical security for everything moving in and out of Crimea from the north. And Ukraine hit it anyway. During the night of June 10th into June 11th, Ukrainian forces launched coordinated strikes targeting key crossings along the corridor. FPV drones and other precision systems reportedly struck bridges over the North Crimean Canal and critical road connections tied to the M17 highway, one of the major arterial roads running through the area. An alternate bridge that Russian engineers had been using to relieve congestion on the main crossings was also reportedly struck. By this point, the campaign had achieved something genuinely unprecedented in this war. All 6 major bridges connecting Crimea to Russian-controlled southern Ukraine had been targeted in the span of 48 hours. Not damaged over months of gradual attrition, targeted deliberately in a coordinated operational sequence within 2 days. The implications for Russia's position in the south are serious. If land routes remain degraded for any significant period of time, the Russian military's ability to sustain operations at scale starts to depend on 2 things: the Crimean Bridge, the long road and rail crossing over the Kerch Strait connecting Crimea to mainland Russia, and maritime logistics through the Black Sea. Here's the problem with both of those alternatives. The Crimean Bridge has already been struck by Ukraine multiple times. It's been repaired, it's been used, but every time it becomes a primary logistics route, it becomes the focus of Ukrainian targeting. A bridge that's been hit before and carries the weight of an entire military supply chain is a bridge that sits at the top of Ukraine's targeting list. Maritime logistics through the Black Sea are even more complicated. Ukraine has spent the last 2 years developing and deploying naval drone systems, unmanned surface vessels that have fundamentally changed how Russia can use the Black Sea. These drones have struck Russian warships. They've been used in attacks near the Crimean Bridge. They've forced the Russian Black Sea Fleet to dramatically change its operational posture. Using the sea as a primary logistics corridor while Ukrainian naval drones are active in those waters is not a safe or reliable solution. In other words, the land routes are damaged, the bridge is vulnerable, the sea is contested. Russia's options for sustaining 100,000-plus troops across southern Ukraine and Crimea are narrowing, and that is precisely what Ukraine intended. Take a second right now. Seriously, pause for just a moment and think about the scale of what this channel covers. If this kind of deep, strategic analysis is what you come here for, then make sure you never miss it. Turn on notifications. Share this video in a forum, a comment section, a Reddit thread, wherever people are talking about this war. Because this story deserves more than a 30-second news clip. It deserves to be understood. So what does Ukraine actually gain from all of this? And where does the strategy go from here? The case for this approach is strong. Degrading Russian mobility means reducing the threat of large-scale Russian counteroffensives in the south. When ammunition deliveries slow down, artillery activity decreases, and Russian artillery has been one of the most lethal forces Ukrainian troops have faced throughout this war. Supply shortages create operational pauses that Ukrainian infantry and mechanized forces can potentially exploit. And the pressure around key cities and strategic locations, places like Mariupol, places that connect the land bridge to Crimea, becomes harder for Russia to manage when their logistics are under constant strain. There's also a deeper strategic logic here. Ukraine has understood for a long time that retaking territory through direct frontal assaults against heavily fortified Russian defensive lines is extraordinarily costly. The minefields alone along sections of the front are among the densest in the history of modern warfare. A ground offensive toward the Perekop Isthmus, for example, would mean pushing through fortified positions while sustaining casualties that Ukraine cannot easily absorb. But if you can make Crimea strategically untenable, if you can make the cost of holding and supplying Crimea so high that Russian military planners start having to make impossible choices, then the calculus changes. You don't necessarily have to physically retake every meter of ground if the enemy can no longer effectively use the ground they hold. This is the doctrine of logistical warfare applied at a strategic level. It's not new in military history. Armies have been doing versions of this for centuries. But what makes Ukraine's execution of it remarkable is the precision, the intelligence behind it, and the speed with which they've been able to string together coordinated strikes across a wide operational area using a combination of drones, precision munitions, and special operations elements. The Azov region, and Mariupol's port in particular, looms large in this context. Mariupol was the city that Azov fighters defended for 86 days before the fall of Azovstal. It was a siege that became a symbol. Thousands of defenders held out against overwhelming force, buying time, holding the line, becoming an icon of Ukrainian resistance in the process. Many of those fighters spent months in Russian captivity afterward. Some were exchanged. The ones who made it back carried something with them, a debt to settle, a mission unfinished. The port of Mariupol has strategic significance beyond symbolism. It's a working port on the Sea of Azov. Russian forces have used it for logistics since taking the city. Disrupting the port's ability to function, even partially, even temporarily, adds another layer of pressure to the supply chain crisis that the bridge strikes have already created. And the strikes in and around this area, coming after years of buildup, intelligence gathering, and preparation, carry a weight that goes beyond military calculation. This is about 4 years of waiting, 4 years of rebuilding, 4 years of watching and planning and preparing for the moment when the opportunity to strike meaningfully was finally there. And when that moment came, Ukraine took it. Decisively, at scale, in a way that will be studied by military planners and analysts for years. So where does this go next? There are 2 paths forward, and both of them shape the rest of this war. The first path is continued logistical isolation. Steady, persistent pressure on every route, every hub, every crossing that Russia depends on to sustain its forces in the south. This doesn't require a massive ground offensive. It requires intelligence, precision, patience, and the ability to keep Russian supply chains under constant threat. If Ukraine can maintain effective fire control over the key corridors in the south, it may be able to restrict Russian military power without physically occupying every bridge and road. The second path involves escalating that pressure into direct territorial action, using the degraded Russian logistics as a window to push harder in specific sectors where supply shortages have weakened Russian defensive capacity. This is harder, riskier, and depends on whether Ukraine has the forces and the equipment to capitalize on the openings that logistical warfare creates. Most likely what comes next is a combination of both. Continued strikes on logistics combined with localized ground pressure at points where Russian forces are most stretched. That's not a guarantee. War never offers guarantees. But the pattern of this campaign suggests that Ukraine's military leadership is thinking several steps ahead, and that the bridge strikes we just witnessed were not an isolated event, but part of a broader, deliberate design. What's clear right now, what cannot be argued, is that the battle for supply lines has become one of the defining fronts of this entire war. Not the front line of trenches and artillery, the invisible front of fuel depots and ammunition dumps and bridges and shipping lanes and pontoon crossings. And in that battle, Ukraine just scored one of the most significant operational successes of the last several years. 4 years of waiting, 4 years of watching Putin use Crimea and Mariupol as symbols of his power, his expansion, his permanence. And in 48 hours, with drones, with precision, with intelligence built over months of patient work, Ukraine struck at the heart of the logistics that make all of that possible. The port may still stand, the peninsula may still be under occupation, but the supply chain that sustains the occupiers has been shaken in a way that cannot easily be repaired, and that, in the long arc of this war, may be exactly what changes everything. If you made it to the end of this video, you're the kind of person this channel exists for. You don't want surface-level headlines. You want to understand what's actually happening and why it matters. So here's what I want you to do. Leave a comment below telling me what you think comes next. Does Ukraine continue the logistical pressure? Does Russia find a way to adapt? And what does this mean for the future of Crimea? I read every comment. Let's talk about it. And if this video gave you something real, a deeper understanding, a clearer picture, then share it. Because that's how this kind of analysis reaches the people who need it most.